This is Matthew Kratter from Trade University, and today I want to talk about how to store your money outside the existing financial system. And what I'm going to show you in this video is something that's much, much better than even having an offshore bank account, which traditionally has really been limited to the ultra connected and the ultra wealthy. So I would say that there's one big thing that the world in general is currently missing about Bitcoin. And I often hear this: what is Bitcoin good for? And people ask that question in a really genuine way. I would say that one of Bitcoin's most valuable functions is giving you the ability to store your savings outside of the financial system and the control of governments. This is not about laundering money or hiding a crime or doing anything illegal. What I'm talking about is actually just a basic human right. The right to be able to hold your savings. In other words, the fruits of your time, your labor, what you earned by getting up really early in the morning, sitting in traffic, being away from your friends and family, your life savings, your life force, and being able to hold that in a secure way that cannot be frozen, cannot be confiscated, cannot be debased or devalued through central bank money printing. We're very lucky in the US and much of the developed world. We haven't really seen funny stuff happening with our bank accounts, at least not in general. But if you live in South America or other parts of the world, you're certainly quite familiar with a corrupt banking system and also a corrupt government. This has been going on in Argentina for a very long time. This is an article dating all the way back to January of 2002, when Argentina was in the process of defaulting on its debt, and they froze actually millions of bank accounts. This is happening right now in China. If you've been following the news, Bank of China declaring that people's savings in their branch are now investment products and cannot be withdrawn. There's actually been gunshots and fights over this as the protesters line up and try to get in the bank. This is not surprising that this happens in China, given the totalitarian government that is there. What's been more surprising is seeing even countries like Canada, which at least traditionally have followed a model closer to the US in terms of freedom. Of course, they don't have the US Constitution and the Bill of Rights, but these sort of things never happened until the 2020s. We had the Canadian government freezing bank accounts, not just of the protesters, but also of people who donated to the protesters, to the Canadian truckers, at a point in time when this was considered completely legal to do. So whatever your view of the Canadian truckers, this was a punishment for something that was not illegal at the time. And it was a very unjust thing to do to a lot of innocent people, especially people who just donated like 20 Canadian dollars to the truckers. Anyone who is holding money in a Cypriot bank in the early part of the last decade, in 2013, knows what it's like to lose savings. This was what was called a bail-in, when Bank of Cyprus depositors lost 47.5% of their savings. Basically, anyone who was storing in excess of 100,000 euros received a haircut and only got some of their money back. And this was a result of a banking crisis in Cyprus. So again, this was money that was owned by the people and was confiscated by the banking system. We all know about Caribbean tax havens, and we know about Swiss tax havens, Swiss secret bank accounts. But the problem with both of these solutions is, do you really want to have to trust banks, custodians, fallible human beings, fallible institutions that can come under a lot of pressure, whether it's Switzerland or Bahamas or Cayman or other parts of the world, because you don't really know how much external or internal pressure, or even privacy hacks it takes to break this privacy veil or even to confiscate your money. And when times get really tough, we should never underestimate what banks, what central banks, and what governments are willing to do to people's savings in order to save their own skin or to get a promotion. If you're storing your money or your personal information with a third party, there's always the risk of a leak or a hack, as a lot of people are discovering with this historic leak of Swiss banking records in the beginning in February of 2022. The only way to secure your savings safely outside of the financial system is through bearer assets that you hold yourself. And this allows you not to have to trust people living on islands in the Caribbean or in Switzerland. A bearer asset is basically something that if you hold it, it's yours and no one can turn it off, no one can take it away from you remotely. Obviously, people can come to you individually, hold a gun to your head, and try to take your wealth. But if a lot of people are holding bearer assets, it becomes very difficult for this kind of attack. So the US government could seize the bearer assets of 100 people, but it certainly could not seize the bearer assets of 100 million people. Some examples of traditional bearer assets would be physical gold. In other words, gold that you hold yourself, not in a warehouse that you trust, not in a bank vault where you have to trust the bank and you have to trust the government to give you access to it. Physical cash is another bearer asset to some extent. And then now we have Bitcoin, which is really the best bearer asset because it's very easy to store large amounts of wealth in it. It's very easy to move it around the world. It's very difficult to move gold and cash around the world. You need giant trucks, you need airplanes, and you need security. Bank accounts can be frozen, as we saw with the Argentina example and the Cyprus example. And your bank account can be frozen no matter where you live. Even in the US, and even if you're completely innocent, they'll freeze your assets, they'll freeze your bank account while you're being investigated. Obviously, as we've learned in the last few months, this is also true in the crypto space. Accounts at Celsius, Vault, BlockFi, Coinbase, Kraken, Gemini, some of these have been frozen. Withdrawals have obviously been frozen at Celsius and Vault, but this can really happen at any company. At any point, they can freeze your money, whether it's crypto, whether it's fiat, or even whether it's Bitcoin, because if you're not holding your own private keys, you're not controlling your Bitcoin and they can just refuse to give it back to you. So this can happen to traditional bank accounts. It can happen to lending accounts at crypto lenders. And it can also happen, a lot of people don't realize, it can also happen to your brokerage account. If you're holding stocks in a brokerage account, that can also be frozen. In the modern era, when you hold stocks in a brokerage account, it's quite likely that the stocks are not being held in your name. You're relying on the brokerage to hold the stocks in their name. This is called holding a security in street name, and it's either held by the brokerage on behalf of the client, or it can be held by the DTCC, the Depository Trust Company, or the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation. The details get a little bit complicated, but a lot of people don't realize this, and you only realize it when your bank account or your brokerage account gets turned off. This has fortunately never happened to me, so I'm not speaking from my own personal experience, but it's obviously happened to many people worldwide. Some of them were criminals, but the vast majority of them were innocent people or people who held political opinions that the people in power did not care for. And as I said, this can happen not just with fiat dollars, it can happen with the crypto version, the stablecoin version of it. This happened back in July of 2020 when some USDC was frozen by the parent company Circle at law enforcement's request. So just because you're holding crypto, especially something that's so centralized like this, doesn't mean that you cannot be turned off and your wealth deactivated. As you've heard me say many times on this channel, and this is not to be a Debbie Downer, but this is just to look reality in its face, the 2020s are going to be and have been and will continue to be a terrible decade. It started off in 2020 with governments flexing their power in ways that have not been seen in the quote-unquote free world in over 90 years. So this is not the decade to trust your government or bank. If you trusted your government and bank over the last 40 years and everything was okay, this doesn't mean that it's going to be okay in the 2020s. We're at a very special point in history where we've entered the fourth turning. We're at the end of the long-term debt cycle where governments worldwide are saddled with so much debt that there's only one way out, and that's through confiscation, and that's through inflating their way out. So there are going to be bank bail-ins like Cyprus in some countries where depositors just take a haircut and they can only withdraw so much money at a time, or maybe some of their savings are permanently seized. This seems unlikely to happen in the US, though of course anything is possible depending who's in charge. But I can see a situation in the US where US pensions, other institutions, this already happens to a certain extent, are forced to hold US government debt, in other words, US treasuries, at yields that are less than inflation. So right now inflation is 8 or 9%. The highest yield on government bonds in the US is something like 3%, 2 to 3%. And so if you mandate that an institution or investment manager or an endowment or a pension holds these government bonds, what you're basically doing is confiscating wealth from the savers because the bonds do not pay enough interest to preserve the purchasing power of those who have parked their money in the bonds. And you need to have a yield, you need to have a return that's greater than the rate of inflation in order to preserve the purchasing power of your money. So this is a very common trick where you force people to hold your government debt, whether they want to or not. And the easiest way to do this is in pensions and people's retirement accounts, where there's less transparency and less visibility by the holders. They don't really realize how they're being stolen from by inflation. Even Warren Buffett, as much as I love to hate him, he's called U.S. Treasuries certificates of confiscation. And this really is true. When you buy one of them, you know that you're going to have less purchasing power after 10 years than when you entered, because the yields on U.S. Treasuries have been and will continue to be way below the rate of inflation. In this decade, if you hold the wrong political views in various countries, you may not be able to access your bank or brokerage account for weeks or months or even years, or maybe never. Even if you're a good citizen, as we've said, you may be forced to hold certain investments like U.S. Treasuries or maybe some sort of war bonds. You can imagine the U.S. government issuing Putin fighting bonds that every citizen is required to purchase, and they tell you it's your patriotic duty. If you don't buy it, maybe you're a Russian or Chinese spy and you're rooting for the enemy, etc. So the government has these sort of propaganda tricks to get everyone to buy their crappy paper. So I think in this environment, it's a really good idea to have some money that cannot be confiscated, that cannot be controlled, that cannot be debased or lose its purchasing power due to central bank money printing, and that also can be sent to anyone in the world without needing a government's permission or a bank's permission to do so. And in the coming years, it's going to be quite easy for those who know how to use Bitcoin to evade government restrictions, capital controls, and other restrictions on what you can do with your money. Even if Bitcoin is deemed officially illegal, you can obviously still send it to anyone in exchange for goods and services. In a similar way, the US government was never able to stomp out drug use or trafficking or selling or buying drugs, even at the height of the drug war. And I think it's very difficult in a large country to do this sort of thing. And I think something similar will happen with Bitcoin, where it's so decentralized and so unstoppable. The people who know how to send it back and forth using their own self-custodian wallet, and they're not relying on an exchange or a third party to send their Bitcoin for them, they will not be able to be stopped by any government restrictions or laws. And again, when I'm talking about government restrictions, I'm not talking about fairly benign government restrictions like not allowing you to drive your car 100 miles per hour while completely wasted. We understand why that's a danger to other people. But what we're talking here is about hostile governments that care nothing for the health, the safety, or the well-being of its citizens and residents. We're talking about hostile governments that want to lock you up into the matrix, harvest your life energy, and tell you what to do with your money, your savings, your family, your body, etc. Hostile governments that want to steal the fruits of your labor through inflation, through money printing, through devaluing the fiat currency in order to make their debt load less. Hostile governments that want to restrict your ability to move about freely, that want to lock you up because they don't like your ideas, and that want to restrict your ability to associate with people who share your ideas and values. Governments that want to restrict your ability to freely express yourself. Governments that want to restrict your ability to defend your family from criminals who break into your house. And the framers of the U.S. Constitution at least understood these basic human rights, even though they've been fairly diluted in the last few decades. So to recap, the 2020s are going to be a decade when bearer assets really begin to matter. And even people who don't understand that technical term, they're going to understand not your keys, not your money, not your possession. Bitcoin is the best bearer asset under the sun. It's easy to hide, it's easy to store, it's easy to send to anyone or receive from anyone, and no government or bank can freeze your account. There are no accounts when it comes to Bitcoin. They're just addresses, they're just UTXOs that can be unlocked using a private key, and this is how the protocol works. So when the next time someone asks you, what's Bitcoin good for anyway? And people who live in parts of Africa, parts of Central and South America, they already know this, but sort of first world citizens who don't understand what Bitcoin is good for, it's good for storing your savings outside the corrupt and evil financial system. In the 2020s, Bitcoin as a quote unquote offshore banking account as this money that's held outside of the financial system is going to be used by those with $100 and those with $100 billion and everyone in between. And by the way, no one is going to be storing $100 billion of money of value in physical gold or cash. It's just too difficult to move around. It's too difficult to access it. And you can't be flexible and move to a more friendly jurisdiction if your money is tied up in real estate, if it's tied up in physical gold or cash, and things like this that are very difficult to move around. So as Satoshi would say, you might want to get a little Bitcoin today. Don't wait until everything's locked down and super difficult to get Bitcoin. Start today, start really small. I'm going to link to 2 videos below where I teach you the best ways to store small and medium amounts of Bitcoin, and then also how to store large amounts of Bitcoin. So wherever you get your Bitcoin, whether you purchase it from an exchange, whether you buy it anonymously, as I teach you how to do in my courses, or whether you earn it in exchange for goods and services, these 2 videos will show you how to hold your own private keys and how to store small, medium, and large amounts of Bitcoin. And I think these skills are going to be essential skills in the coming years in the 2020 decade. If you found this video helpful, be sure to hit that subscribe and like button. Hit the notification bell if you want to be notified when I publish my next video. And let me know your questions and comments in the comment section below. Thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.